So this morning, our first passage is going to be in Exodus chapter 21. If you guys want to move over there, we've been talking about slavery. This is an introduction to Philemon, and that's because that has a slave in Philemon, and so we'll talk about that over on the New Testament side. But we talked a little bit last week on how we have to have some context when we talk about slavery because slavery means different things at different times to different people. And so what we've been talking about is Old Testament slavery, um, and kind of looking at, we haven't quite tackled it yet, but quite kind of looking at whether God affirms slavery or not. But we also noticed that when we looked at it in the Old Testament, it's very different than what we think of as slavery, as modern slavery, as what was in our past U.S. history. Um, but there was one key point that we needed to get out from what we looked at yesterday, which is God doesn't want us to oppress other people. And even if they are our slaves, we're still not supposed to oppress them. We're supposed to take care of them and treat them like people because they are people. They are God's children, and He loves them. And so He was just constantly reminding us of that. So we're going to look a little bit more at that, and then we're going to shift as we go through some of these passages and see this cool little picture that God has about slavery. And maybe it's pointing to the gospel. We'll try to figure that out. But we're in Exodus chapter 21. Mr. Coleman, can you read verses 18 through 27?
Let me change. I got to change my Bible to Spanish in English. Okay, 21 verses what?
18 to 27.
When men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or his fist, the man does not die, but takes to his bed. Then if the man rises again and walks outdoor with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed. How far?
Quite a ways. 27.
When a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. And if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out and there is no harm, the one who hit her surely shall be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judge determines. But if there is harm, then he shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. When a man strikes an eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out a tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of the tooth.
All right, March, we're in Exodus 21. And Tom, we're in Exodus 21. All right, good to see you guys. So again, we're talking about slavery here. We've been going over it, and here is some more law regarding slaves. I started us a little bit early because I wanted to get us some context in it, and the context of this passage really is restitution. It is how you deal with when you harm somebody or injure somebody, how you are supposed to pay them back or do something like that. So we see it starts off with two men fighting, and if they fight and one man beats up another man so badly that he dies, he's in trouble, right? Then he's supposed to be put to death. It's a capital crime. You're not supposed to be killing people. And particularly, there is some provisions for if it's manslaughter and accidental. There's ways to save your life. But in general, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to be killing people. And so if you do that, if you get in a fight and you hurt him bad enough to kill him, you're supposed to die. But if you hurt him bad enough so he doesn't die, but he's just, he can't move, he can't work, whatever, and he's stuck, then what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to pay his wages and make sure that he's paid for and make sure that he's well until he's healed. Once he's healed, then your obligation is done. But as long as he's still healing from the injuries you caused him, you're supposed to pay for that. And there's an important bit about this, and that's why we go over this, is because in this context, we got to keep that in context and keep this in our minds when we read verse 22, because people will read verse 22 and then they'll be like, oh man, this is just so messed up, and they just missed a whole bunch of stuff here. And that says, if a man I'm sorry, not 22, it is let's see, 26. If a man, no, it's not 26. Verse 20. If a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. So we see here, if you beat up your slave and you kill your slave, that's a punishment. That's capital crime. You're not supposed to be killing people. And again, God's emphasizing that slaves are people. They are valued. God loves them, and you can't just take their lives. They're not just worthless. And so if you kill your slave, you're in trouble. However, if you don't kill your slave, it says in 21, notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. So people will read this and they'll be like, oh man, if you're a slave owner and you kill your slave, that's wrong. But if you just beat him up and he almost dies, but he doesn't die, then that's okay. But that's not what this passage is saying, okay? Remember, if you fight with somebody and you kill them, that's punishable by death. But if you don't kill them, you have to pay their wages, all right? You have to pay restitution. You have to still provide for them. And so we get this thing with a slave where if you beat up a slave and you don't kill him, then who are you paying your wages to? Because he's actually employed to you, and his wages belong to you. So you don't just pay yourself. And so it's got this idea that, he's your property. So it doesn't make sense that you're paying his wages, because you're just paying yourself. So there's no direct punishment for that. However, if we keep reading and we get to verse 26, there's an interesting twist on this. And it says, if a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. So here's the thing. If you beat up your slave gets to go free. So if you beat up your slave so badly that he doesn't die, you beat him up into an inch of his life and he doesn't die, then you have to provide for him still until he's healed, and then he gets to go free. So we don't want to miss this. This isn't a provision where God's saying, okay, you're allowed to mistreat somebody in this way. You're not supposed to mistreat somebody. And we don't want to get caught on this eye and this tooth and say, well, only if the master beats up this slave and knocks out his eye or knocks out a tooth. Otherwise, he's okay. Because if you read the verse before that, it's in verse 23, in verse 24, it says, if anyone harm follows, you shall give his life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. The idea here is restitution. The idea here is not that it's just limited. It's not limited to one of these things, right? It's not limited when you hurt somebody. It's not limited to their eye or their tooth or a burn, or it's everything. And that's why it's ending with wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Everything has a consequence. And so the same thing here is with the slave, except for with the slave, restitution is freedom. So we don't want to get those two things mixed up. We don't want to get stuck in this idea of it's just an eye or it's just a tooth. Because if you look in context, that's not what this passage is saying. It's saying you've got to pay restitution. And for a slave, that means his freedom. He's free or she is free. Whew. Any thoughts or comments?
John.
Yeah.
No, and I think, with the slave owner, then he's going to be out not only a slave, but now he has to go purchase another slave. So,
absolutely right.
It's a monetary incentive not to do that, as opposed, also in addition to that, he's out of the money as well. So, he or she, whoever the slave owner is, will have a monetary effect as well, in addition to, losing a slavery.
And that's, and I thank you for bringing that up. And that's in verse 21, notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. That's what that's saying, is you just lost your slave by doing that. You just lost your property. You lost something. And so there is some payment in a sense in that way. It's not like a slave owner gets to mistreat their slave and they don't have any consequences. God's saying, no, you just lost that. And remember, we talked about this a little last week. The idea of slavery here was a financial transaction. You work for me for 6 years and I will give you whatever. And so in this case, what happens is you just lost your whatever. You just lost those wages. The slave gets to go free. Good point, Mark. Katie.
But what throws most people and myself is the in 21 it says survives a day or two. So if he's alive for 2 days after you beat him and then dies, there's nothing. That's the weird part. That's the strange part, because there are times when people are in bad enough shape that they can survive for a day or two. But
yeah,
that's the only part that kind of throws people off. It's really is the part that everybody gets to is, well, there's no harm if he, I'm going to beat him bad enough that he's going to live for 2 days.
Yeah.
But
I'm not sure that that's exactly what it means. I mean, it could be, right? And people like to split hairs, so it's possible that they could, oh, he lived for 2 days, so I'm okay. You're not allowed to avenge that person. But my understanding, especially when we talk about the eye for eye, tooth for tooth, is, living for 2 days and then dying is still not a good place that you want to be, because there's still going to be some consequence for that. I understand this whole passage can be hard when you just look at one verse. You really got to look at the whole context of it.
Yeah.
All right. Any other comments before we move to our next passage? This is good. This is interesting. But again, it's a reminder that slaves are people. You're supposed to treat them as children of God because they are, because God loves them.
Yeah, and this part of Exodus, isn't this kind of laying out the societal rules for all the people, the nation of Israel anyways, John? Kind of,
That's right.
I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. There's, basically these people have been in slavery for what, 400 years, and now they're free. So, they've been slaves. And so, but and how they were treated, it's kind of like you have to forget all that. This is how, God, the Lord wants, God wants the system to work, or these are your rules to follow. I think that you kind of have to, from the 10,000 foot elevation, kind of sort of,
yeah, it was the chapter before was talking about the 10 commandments.
Mm-hmm.
And so now he's explaining, okay, here's the 10. Now we got to explain, because we as people want to stretch it as far as we can. Oh, well, what's the definition of lie? And what's the definition of is, and all those other things that we all fight about, is what's the definition of that?
Right.
And that's a good point. And there's other chapters in here, which there's just too much for us to go through everything, but where God talks about oppression and he says, don't oppress your brother, don't oppress him. And he says it more than once, where he says, because I brought you out of the land of Egypt. You were once slaves and now you're free. And so there is that whole idea, Charlie, that you brought up, that they were slaves, they were used to it. And now they have the ability to have their own slaves, and God's saying, don't treat them the way you were treated. Don't do that.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right. Now we're going to jump to something even a little bit more difficult, and that's Leviticus chapter 25. So we've been talking about slaves, And one of the things that's good to point out is slavery is everywhere in the world at this time, right? There are slaves. Every nation allows it to some degree. I mean, we even have slavery in our world now. Some nations still allow it today, which is crazy. But it is still there. So they're going to be involved with these other nations, and they're going to have these different rules about slaves than Israel because they're their own nation. But it's an institution that's everywhere, and so we have to recognize that when we're looking through the culture here, and people will make the claim that God is bad because he's affirming slavery, and he doesn't affirm slavery. And we're going to get to a verse later, which I think totally, in my opinion, that verse kills that whole idea. But we'll talk about that later. But now we're going to look at something that's really interesting. So we're in chapter 25 of Leviticus. We're going to start in verse 39 through 46. And let's see who's up for reading. Dad, are you up for reading? Can you read verse 39 through 46?
Yes, I can do that. And if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and he shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possessions of his father. For they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, and they shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God. And as for your male and female slaves whom you have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you and their families who are with you, which they begat in your land, and they shall become your property. And you shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you inherit them as a possession, and they shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor.
All right, so we have these more rules about slaves, although much of these are similar to what we have read before. But it is interesting. There's a couple of new twists here. One is God says, hey, if you take somebody as a slave who is your brother, a Jew, you're not supposed to rule over them with rigor, right? You're not supposed to oppress them. You're not supposed to be beating them. You're supposed to take care of them. You're not supposed to oppress them. That's the key thing here. And for sure, you're not supposed to take a slave and sell them to a foreigner, because they're going to have completely different rules about how you deal with slaves. And God reminds them and says, hey, I just brought you out of slavery here. You don't go sell yourselves to slaves to other nations over there. You keep them here. So there's this rule. Also, we see there's this extra break of the year of Jubilee. So remember, we just read how slaves are supposed to be freed after 7 years. They also have a Sabbath. So after 7 years, they're freed. But we also see in the year of Jubilee, which is every 50 years, they're also supposed to be freed. So there's lots of opportunities. That the slavery, the point here is slavery is not permanent, right? When you take a brother as a slave, they're paying off a debt. It's not supposed to be permanent, and you're supposed to treat them more like a hired servant than you are like what the rest of the world treats them as slaves. That's what God's telling them. Treat them as a hired servant. You're paying them wages. And in Deuteronomy, there's a passage where it says, you got to pay them wages. And when their time is up, you're supposed to even give them more stuff as they leave. And God says he'll bless you if you treat people that way. So we see this. This is really interesting. let's see. But there's another thing here that's interesting and a little tough, but I think there's a purpose for it, and that is, um, let's see, verse 45, verse 46, and they're talking about buying foreigners as slaves. And it says in verse 46, and you make them as an inheritance for your children after you to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. So here's another kind of wrinkle in the whole thing is if you take a foreigner as a slave, they actually can be your slave for life. Unlike the children of Israel, when you take them as a slave, it's only for 6 years. And then there's the year of Jubilee, which all the slaves have to be set free. But for a foreigner, it's permanent. So we look at this and like, man, that's tough. That's rough. But there's this really interesting picture here, which I want to bring out here. And if we look at slavery as sin, right? As you're born in, as you're a sin, as you are a slave to sin. If you don't know God, you're a slave to sin forever. But if you do know God, you're not a slave to sin forever. Slavery is temporary. Once you know God, once you come to know him, you actually can choose your master, which is kind of weird, but it's not permanent, right? And so there's this picture here that those children of God, slavery is not permanent. But for those who do not know God, slavery can be permanent. And that's really interesting. If they come to know God, then they can be then they don't have to be the slaves. Let me back up. That's not what this passage is saying. That's what I'm saying is after it now, the way it is now with sin, I'm not saying this the way I'm trying to say this, but with sin, if you're a slave to sin, you're a slave to sin unless you come to know Jesus. And then he breaks that bondage of sin. And so there's that picture here that if you don't know God, you could be a slave forever. But if you do know him, it's not permanent. What do you guys think about this? You think maybe I'm just way off on this picture? Or?
No, I think you're right on. I mean, I never thought about it that way, about being a slave to sin without Christ. But yeah, we're in debt because of man's original sin, because we fell. We're all born into sin, and we're all slaves to sin unless somebody redeems us. So
Well,
yeah.
don't use the word redemption yet. That's in the next verse. But yes, you're right. And it is true. If you don't know Jesus, you really are a slave to something. Your flesh, slave to, you're a slave to something. Everybody is actually who is your master? Now, you might think it's you, but what does that even mean? You don't have very good understanding of the world around you. So you're still a slave to your flesh. But everybody's a slave to something. The question is, are you going to know God and let him be your master, or are you going to try to let someone else be your master? All right. This is a tough topic, so it's been a little quiet, but that's okay. We're going to move on. We're still in chapter 25, but we're going to move on to this next part, verse 47 to 55. Charlie, can you read verse 47 to 55?
Sure. Okay. If a sojourner or stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner close to you, or to a member of the stranger's family, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his uncle's son may redeem him, or anyone who is near of kin to him in his family may redeem him, or if he is able, he may redeem himself. Thus he shall reckon with him who bought him. The price of his release shall be according to the number of years from the year that he was sold to him until the year of Jubilee. It shall be according to the time of a hired servant for him. If there are still many years remaining according to them, he shall repay the price of his redemption from the money with which he was bought. Say 251 or farther. all the way to
55.
55, okay. And if there remain but a few years until the year of Jubilee, then he shall reckon with him, and according to his years, he shall repay him the price of his redemption. He shall be with him as a yearly hired servant, and he shall not rule with rigor over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed in these years, then he shall be released in the year of Jubilee, he and his children with him. For the children of Israel are servants to me. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
All right, so we get this other interesting picture here where although you weren't supposed to sell one of your slaves to a foreigner, if a foreigner lived in this area, it lived in the land of Israel, in the land of Canaan, then they could actually, a Jew could sell himself to a foreigner who lived in that area. And I guess maybe foreigner is not the right word, but somebody who was not a Jewish Jew in that area, you could sell yourself to them. But they still had to follow some rules. And they might say, well, you know, I don't follow the Sabbath. I don't follow Yahweh. There still was the year of Jubilee where they were required to let those slaves free. So they still had to let them free on the year of Jubilee. And also, here's the cool part, they were required to allow them to be redeemed.
Mhm.
So they could have slaves in that area, but they had to be allowed to be redeemed. And redeemed means simply that a family member, somebody said, oh, you know what, that person is of good value to me, of high value to me. I'm going to pay their debt off so that they are no longer a slave, and then they're free. And so any family member, well, there's a list, but the family member the redeemer could do that. And so as long as you weren't so desperate that your family has been, you know, destroyed and gone, there's always this hope that, you know, I'm selling myself into slavery, but maybe somebody will redeem me. And I just want to point this out because this is a great picture that we have with Jesus, where we're sinners, we're slaves to sinners, and yet Jesus was like, oh no, man, but they are really important to me, so I'm going to redeem them. And so there's this great picture of redemption. And I don't want us to miss that, because I think, well, just in general, I don't want us to miss the gospel whenever we get to hear the gospel that, hey, God loves you and he sent his son to redeem you. It's been paid. All of us have the ability to know God now because our sin has been paid, so we can be redeemed from our slavery and be made free. And not just us, every single person, they have the ability to be redeemed from their slavery. Now, part of it is you got to recognize that you're a slave, right? In our world today, you got to recognize that you're a slave before you're willing to say, hey, I need salvation from my sin, from my slavery. But here it was very clear. You were a slave, you had a physical master, and you were desiring redemption. And God set up a way where you didn't have to wait till the year of Jubilee. Somebody could redeem you before that happened. All right, any thoughts?
This also shows us that this slavery that we're talking about is totally different than the slavery we saw in the US and in Europe, because in 49, it says if he grows rich, he can redeem himself.
Yeah.
Which means there's a whole different aspect of slavery here, because it is a position where you can redeem yourself. And I don't want to get away from the gospel, but it's just interesting. I wanted to point out that the slavery we had here in the US was totally different than what we're talking here in slavery.
And that's worth repeating again. This idea is completely different than what we had. First of all, it wasn't racial. You could have your brother as a slave. You could have a foreigner as a slave. It wasn't racial. They had rights, right? We just read some of them. They had rights. They could free themselves. They could redeem themselves. You were supposed to pay them. You were supposed to treat them as a person. There is a lot of differences between this idea of slavery that they had there and the modern slavery that we had in the United States. You're absolutely right.
And there's also a connection with the a kinsman redeemer, when we see that in Ruth, where you're, someone who's close to you, close to your family, can bring back what was lost, to pay back what was lost and bring it close again to the family. And obviously that's a connection to the gospel later. But I love the little thread that's here in the background, where a family member or someone close to you can buy it back or buy you back, right?
I also really like how this is tied in with the year of Jubilee, because even if you don't have this kinsman redeemer, guess what? Every 50 years, God's going to step in and he's going to redeem you. And he's going to say, okay, all the slaves are free now. You have to let them free. There is someone, God is saying he will step in every 50 years and make sure that that happens. So even if you don't have that kinsman redeemer, you're like, oh man, it's so hopeless, and then God is saying, but it's not hopeless, because I'm going to step in every so often and make sure that this happens as well. So it's good. It's good. He's our ultimate kinsman redeemer. All right. Trying to see. Let's see. Let me just look. I don't want to run out of time like I did last time. Let's go. We're going to go to Deuteronomy now, and I'm just going to go through this one really quick. I've talked about it slightly. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 12 through 18. And let's see. Tim, are you up for reading?
Are we in any particular version? Does it matter?
Whichever you like. It doesn't matter. Well, I
Alrighty.
mean, I shouldn't say that. It does matter, but we're going to go with an accepted version,
So how about
globally
Greek?
accepted.
Can I read it in Greek? Is that all right?
You can read it in Greek. We'll follow along.
If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as your Lord God has blessed you. Remember that they were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. But if your servant says to you, I do not want to leave you because he loves you and your family and is well off with you, then take an awl, push it through the earlobe in the door, and he will become your servant for life. Do the same for your female servant. Do not consider it a hardship to set your servant free, because their service to you these 6 years has been worth twice as much as that of a hired hand. And the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do.
So this is just this cool little picture again of God saying, don't oppress them and take care of them. And when they're done, send them off with something extra, give them a little more. It's interesting that God says they're worth a double of a hired servant. Okay, so he's telling them, you have a slave, they're worth more than a hired servant. A hired servant can just leave at any time, but here they have to stay. And so he's saying their value is worth more. So show them that. Show them that their value is worth more by giving them a little extra. And then, and I like the way it ends there in verse 18, then the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. So it's just a reminder, treat people like God loves them, because he does. And he will bless you when you treat them that way. Treat people with grace and be gracious to them, give them abundantly. So I just like that whole thing. So and next one is Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 7. And this is a repeat, and I just want to bring this up because it is a repeat. He actually says this. We went over this a little bit last time, but it's so important that God says it twice. And so I just want to read that real quick. Deuteronomy 24:7, it says, if a man is found kidnapping any of his brethren of the children of Israel and mistreats him or sells him, then that kidnapper shall die, and you shall put away the evil from among you. So in the nation of Israel, you were not allowed to be a slave trader. You weren't allowed to just go and capture Israelites, force them into slavery, and then sell them. right? You weren't allowed to do that. That if you did that, people were allowed to kill you. And I just want to point that out. God didn't set up this whole thing and allow slavery so that man can make a profit off of it. He didn't do that. He didn't want men oppressing other men.
I mean, like Joseph's brothers did.
Exactly. Yeah. No, you're right. Right. That was the under this part. I mean, that was before this law was given. But if it happened after the law was given, that was punishable by death. Right. They shouldn't have done that. And also, as we saw in these commandments, you're not allowed to sell them to foreigners either, which is what they did. So absolutely, God didn't want another Joseph happening. He was trying to prevent that from happening. Not that Joseph was bad, but just how he was treated and oppressed there by his brothers. All right, we're going to tackle one last passage here, and that is Deuteronomy chapter 23. So you can move back a chapter, and it's verse 15 and 16. And so this, I think, gives us a good picture of what God thinks of slavery. But let's read it, and then you guys can tell me what you think. So it's Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 15 and 16. 15 says, "You shall not give back to his master the slave who escaped from his master to you. He may dwell with you in your midst, in the place which he chooses within one of your gates, where it seems best to him. You shall not oppress him." So this is talking about runaway slaves. If a slave comes to you, to the nation of Israel, and seeks asylum, they're supposed to give it. And not only that, they're supposed to find him a place to live. He gets to live where he wants to, and you're not supposed to oppress him. So I'll just say that one more time. If a slave comes to the city and wants to be freed, you're not supposed to return him to his master. You're supposed to protect him and give him a place to live. And that's what it means why it says he can stay within the gates there. That's the idea of protection. You're protecting him. So what do you guys think about this verse? Do you think that this shows the heart of God in slavery?
It's a good setup for Philemon.
Yeah.
Why would a slave that escapes from somebody else be different from a slave that escapes from you?
It doesn't matter. That's the point. If he escapes from you, he can go to the city and say, "Hey, I want protection from my master," and you have to go, "Okay, we're going to protect you." So that's the point that I'm making here, is that the idea that God had set up was that Israel was a place of freedom for slavery. If a slave wanted to be free, they could just run to a city of Israel, and then they were going to be free. They were going to be protected. And so in my mind, God had set this all up. So not only do slaves have rights, but they can just walk away from it. They can just leave it. But even then, I want to point out this really cool picture here, which is if you're a foreigner and you don't know God, you're permanently in slavery. You're stuck in slavery. How can you be free? You go close to where God is. You go to God's children to find protection. And so there's this picture here of, hey, if you want to be close to God, you can be close to God, and we're not limiting it to anyone, including the slave, and we're going to make sure that the slave is safe and becomes free if they want to come and they want to know about Yahweh. If they want to know who God is, they can come to the city, they can find out who he is, and they're free. And I love that picture here. You can stray away from God and there's no protection from slavery. But if you come close to him, if you come close to the city where his people dwell, you're supposed to be safe there. So I think when people make the claim here that the Old Testament affirms slavery, I would point out this one verse, which says, hey, he said, yeah, you can have slaves, but if they run away from you, that you don't get to have them back. So that doesn't sound like he's affirming slavery. That sounds like he's saying, hey, there is a culture and and a system for slavery, an institution where it is a financial transaction, and it would be like going bankrupt. If you ran away from your master, you can go bankrupt, and you can do that here in our nation, right? You can go bankrupt if you have so many bills. You can go bankrupt, but you can only do it once, because after you do it, you can't get a loan again, right? So it's the same type of deal. You can be a slave, you can do it to gain some financial whatever, some benefit, and you can run away, but you can only do it once. If you run away to another city, nobody's going to say, okay, you can sell yourself to me as a slave, because they're going to be like, well, but you just ran away from your master. It's really risky. So in that terms, if we're just thinking financially, that fits very similar to what our culture has today. But again, you don't have to think of it financially either, because he doesn't, he's not talking necessarily about an Israelite slave here. So this means people from other countries could come to the nation of Israel and ask for freedom, and they could have that freedom. So, and that wasn't necessarily a financial transaction. You know, they could have been born into slavery. They could have been captured after a battle and become a slave then. There's a whole bunch of reasons why you could become a slave. But if you manage to escape and run to Israel, they would protect you.
It just doesn't sound like slavery would be very, what's the word for it? Profitable in Israel. I would, if that was the situation I was in, I wouldn't want any slaves, because it'd be investing in something that could just leave.
Yeah, it'll be profitable depending on how you treat them, right? It'll be really profitable like if you're treating them with, giving them the swimming pool and, making sure that they're, but honestly, it's kind of a catch-22, because ultimately the worse you treat them, yeah, they're out immediately, but if, again, if you have the cabana up and they're part of the family, it becomes really easy, and it can be extremely profitable, where you could possibly be getting slaves from other people because they're having so much fun over at your house. So, et cetera.
Something else you didn't talk about in 24 when we read it was the idea of being a bondservant, where if you treated them well enough, they didn't want to leave.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to. You don't want to escape from a place where you're being treated well, things are going good, and that's really what the Lord's talking about, is being. And Paul writes several times that he is a bond servant or bond slave to Jesus Christ, because that's where he wants to be, and that's where we need to be, is a bond slave to Jesus Christ, and not a slave to sin, as we've been talking about. So it's how you treat people is what it really comes down to. And what he's showing here is, in Israel, we're going to treat our slaves correctly. We're going to do it the right way, because they are part of the family, like Katie was saying there.
That's right. And we talked about a little bit last week too, where even a bondservant, they had some protection, which was if you wanted to stay with your master and be a slave to him in perpetuity, right? You wanted to go past your 7 years. They couldn't just make you do that. You had to go to the judges and tell them your intention as a slave. Say, hey, I want to stay with this master. And then they would pierce the ear and go through that whole process. But the idea here is the master couldn't force you to become a bondservant. You had to choose to become a bondservant. So there's this great picture. And you're right, Dad. I think the whole point is that it could be profitable, but it only works if it's profitable to your slave as well as to you, right? If you're both benefiting from it, then things will go well. If you're oppressing someone, then it's not going to be profitable. And that's the way God set it up. If you oppress someone, you are not supposed to benefit from that. And so that's this great picture here. And that's one of the things that I want to point out. People will make the claim. Now, it's true, people could use the Bible to affirm their slavery by taking things out of context. But notice how we read some more, particularly that one passage that had a lot of difficult stuff. You got to take it all in context. and see that the way God designed this is he allowed slavery, but it was only if you treat people well. And then, even then, it was they still got to choose to be a slave because they could run away any day, anytime, and they could be free. They always had the option to run away and be free, which is a crazy thing. How do you set up slavery and make it work when your slave is always allowed to run away and be free?
So that's an interesting point, John. Then maybe our translations for the word servant shouldn't be slave, because basically what you're describing here is a worker employee-employer relationship. They're trading their time for not necessarily money, but compensation of housing and food. So maybe our culture and the way the church looks at these passages shouldn't be one as a slave, but as a doula or a servant. And if you go into the Hebrew translations and the Greek translations, it is servant, it is slave, it is employee. So maybe we should adjust our perceptions on this.
Yeah, and there's this great video on YouTube where the ESV translators, they argue about whether or not that word doulos, if that should be servant or slave, and how they should translate it, because it literally means slave. But our idea of slavery is so different, and slavery has such a bad connotation to it that they're like, we're afraid that if we translate it as slave, it will take away from the rest of the passage, and that people will be focused on that word slave. And so they end up translating it as servant, because you're right, Tim, this is very different than what we think of as slavery. But to be fair, this is what they thought of as slavery, right? And then when we get to the New Testament with Roman slavery and that word where it's still translated servant, that is what they thought of as slavery. It wasn't racial back then either. It was different. It wasn't as good as this, because the Romans could totally mistreat their slaves, and that was okay with the Roman government. So it was still different than this, but it still wasn't the same as what we think of as slavery. So it's a good point.
I think of the prodigal son. And I think that, maybe the prodigal son would be a good example of this, because he was kind of a slave, I guess. He was feeding the guy's pigs for whatever he could eat. And then he just left. He went back to his father and he said, I'm going to go back to my father. My father's slaves are better treated than this. So I'm going to go back to my father. I think this may be a picture of that.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. That is true. And here's the thing, we may not recognize it, but if we're following Jesus, he's our master, right? We're slaves to him, but we're in the bondservant category of like, he's such a good master that I want to go and I want to be under him. He's the one who actually has authority and control over everything in the universe. He knows what's going on. He can make proper decisions, and he's willing to do it in my life, where my life will bring him glory, and he'll make sure that what's supposed to happen happens. So he's a good master. So the prodigal son picture is a great picture of how all of this works out. The biggest issue is a lot of times people don't realize that they are slaves. They don't realize that they are slaves to something. There is something that they are following, and they're following it so deeply that they'll do it even when it's not in the best interest of themselves, and they'll be oppressed by it. Contrast that with Jesus, who he is our master, and we will follow him, and he's doing what's best. He knows what's actually best, and he's taking care of us in that way. I like it.
Yeah, good point. And you're really just trading one master for another, but you're in Christ. He's the better master, right? Because no one's really truly free in that sense. Like you're either a slave to sin or a slave to Christ. And so I think what we forget is that we tend to think that, hey, there's the point where you're actually free. No, you're not. Like there's a point where you are a slave to sin, and then you trade that up to be a slave to the Lord Jesus Christ, who's the better master.
like it. All right. Any other comments? And then, yeah, any other comments before we wrap it up? So next week we will start Philemon, and we will talk. We'll just talk briefly about slavery when we hit Philemon, and then we're going to get into the passage, and we'll just let the talk of slavery come when it comes in Philemon. But that's where we're heading, and I just wanted us to recognize here that when people say that the Bible affirms slavery, I don't think that they really understand what they're saying, because what God's idea of slavery is very different than what, even in our short past in American history, it was completely different than that idea of slavery. It's different than what other nations had for slavery. And on top of all of that, we have this last verse, which was a slave could leave anytime and they were free. They had always had the choice to run away and take refuge in a city, and they would be free there. The city had to protect them. So it's very different.
Just one more thought, John, real quick. If a slave ran away, he still has to have an income. He still has to have a means of supporting himself. And in that culture, in that time, I don't think it was so easy to find a career or a job or start a business. It's just interesting.
Yeah,
I have somewhere to go to. If he had nowhere to go, there was no reason to run away.
Wait, I think I was tracking until the last thing. So yes, you were right. They still have to have, they still need provisions, right? But that's this idea here. If you go and live in the city gates, you have a place to stay. So you have that provided for you, and they even get to choose where they're staying, which city that they're going to. So the provision of the household, of where they're going to live, that's all provided. You're right; they still need to work to get some food, but that's the whole thing here. Is it wasn't set up so that they could come and just, what's the word, mooch off of the rest of the city, right? They didn't just get to come into the city and just sit back and do nothing and say, well, I'm a freed slave, so I don't have to do any work. They still had to find work. But the direction is that of the city is, you're protecting him. You're making sure he has, so you need to make sure he can find himself a job so he can work. So I think that's all encapsulated in this idea of protecting him, not that he wouldn't work, but that he would have the ability to find a job. Right? So you couldn't say, well, I'm not going to hire you because you're a slave. You're supposed to say, okay, you're a freed slave. I'll hire you and I'll pay for you. So they still had to work.
So they had to become a bondservant.
A hired servant.
Yeah, bondservant. That's
that's different.
That's what they had in those days.
No, that's different. A hired servant, you could pay them daily wages. A bondservant lived with you, and you provided for them, and they were under obligation to stay with you for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, I didn't think they had hired servants in those days.
That we actually read in one of the previous passages where he says, don't take your brother as a slave, instead take him as a hired servant.
Okay.